I was sound asleep in row 12, somewhere over the Atlantic, when the captain's voice crackled through the intercom with words that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Is there a pilot on board?" My eyes snapped open. Around me, passengers were stirring, murmuring, looking around nervously. But I wasn't looking around. I was looking inward, at 15 years of flying experience that I'd walked away from, at a career that had been systematically destroyed by men who couldn't stand the idea of a woman in the cockpit. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Sarah Mitchell, former commercial airline pilot, sitting in coach on my way to London for what I'd told everyone was a vacation, but was really my last-ditch attempt to find work with a European carrier. And now, 37,000 feet above the ocean, they needed exactly what I used to be, what I still was, if I'm being honest. You don't just stop being a pilot because some desk jockey decides your gender makes you a liability. The flight attendant was making her way down the aisle now, her professional smile not quite masking the panic in her eyes. "Excuse me, is anyone here a pilot?" she was asking, row by row. I watched her approach, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day I'd been grounded. Not grounded for incompetence, mind you. Not grounded for safety violations or poor performance. Grounded because I'd reported Captain Williams for showing up to work drunk. And apparently that made me a troublemaker. Apparently that made me someone who didn't understand team dynamics and created a hostile work environment. Funny how reporting a safety violation makes you the problem, isn't it? "Ma'am?" The flight attendant had reached my row. Her nameplate read Jennifer, and she looked about 25, probably new to this job, definitely not prepared for whatever was happening in that cockpit. "Are you by any chance a pilot?" I looked up at her, seeing my reflection in her worried eyes. Jeans, sneakers, hair in a messy bun. Not exactly the image of authority these situations usually call for. "I am," I said quietly. It's complicated. Jennifer's relief was palpable. "Oh, thank God. Can you come with me, please?" The captain collapsed, and the first officer is asking for assistance. As I stood up, unbuckling my seatbelt with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, I caught the eye of the elderly gentleman sitting across the aisle. He was wearing a military pin on his jacket, and he gave me a small nod. "Go get him, pilot," he whispered. I don't know why, but that simple acknowledgement nearly undid me. Here was a stranger who saw exactly what I was, what I'd always been, regardless of what anyone else had decided about my qualifications. Following Jennifer toward the cockpit, I could feel the weight of every passenger's stare. Some looked hopeful, others looked skeptical, a few looked downright concerned, and I couldn't blame them. If I were sitting in their seat, watching a woman in casual clothes being asked to potentially fly the plane, I might have questions too. But here's what they didn't know, what the executives at Continental Airways had chosen to ignore when they'd systematically dismantled my career. I'd logged over 8,000 flight hours. I'd successfully handled 3 emergency landings. I'd flown in conditions that would make seasoned pilots think twice. And I'd done it all while being told, in ways both subtle and overt, that I didn't belong. The cockpit door opened, and I stepped into organized chaos. The captain was slumped in his seat, unconscious but breathing. The first officer, a young man who couldn't have been more than 30, looked up at me with desperate relief. "Are you really a pilot?" he asked. "Please tell me you're really a pilot." His voice cracked on the word really, and I could see the weight of 300 lives pressing down on his shoulders. "I'm really a pilot," I assured him, moving to check the captain's condition. "What's your experience level?" 2 years commercial, he said. "This is only my 3rd transatlantic flight, and I've never handled an emergency of this magnitude." The captain just collapsed about 10 minutes ago. "We think it might be his heart." I glanced at the instrument panel, my training kicking in automatically. Altitude steady at 37,000 feet. Airspeed normal, course on track. The plane was flying itself beautifully, but that wouldn't last if we encountered any turbulence or needed to make course corrections. "What's your name?" I asked the first officer. "David," he replied. "David Chen." Well, so much for avoiding ethnic names, but this was real life now, not a corporate diversity meeting. "Okay, David, here's what we're going to do. You're going to stay in the left seat and continue as pilot in command. I'm going to take the right seat and assist. We need to get medical attention for the captain and prepare for a possible emergency landing." As I settled into the first officer's seat, muscle memory took over. My hands found the controls, my eyes scanned the instruments, my brain began calculating alternatives. It had been 18 months since I'd last sat in a cockpit, but it felt like coming home. This was where I belonged. This was what I was meant to do. And for the first time in 2 years, nobody was questioning my right to be here. "Do we have any doctors on board?" I asked Jennifer, who was still hovering near the door. "We're checking," she replied. "But even if we do, the captain's condition looks serious. He's going to need immediate medical attention when we land." I turned to David. "What's our fuel situation?" He checked his instruments. "We've got about 5 hours remaining at current consumption." "And our destination?" "Heathrow. We're about 3 hours out." I nodded, running calculations in my head. "We have options. We can continue to London if the captain stabilizes, or we can divert to Shannon, or even back to Boston if necessary. But first, we need to assess exactly what we're dealing with." A doctor had been found among the passengers, a cardiologist named Dr. Rodriguez, who confirmed what we'd suspected. The captain had suffered a heart attack. Not massive, but serious enough that he would be unconscious for the remainder of the flight, which meant it was just David and me, a green first officer, and a blacklisted pilot, responsible for getting everyone safely across the Atlantic. "Have you ever performed an ILS approach in weather?" I asked David as we reviewed our options. London was reporting heavy fog with visibility down to minimums. "Simulated," he admitted, "but never in actual conditions like this." "Of course not, because that's how it works in aviation. You train and train and train, but nothing really prepares you for the moment when everything goes wrong and you're the only thing standing between 300 people and disaster." "Well," I said, settling back in my seat and adjusting my headset, "today's going to be a learning experience for both of us." The next hour was a masterclass in crew resource management, something they drilled into us endlessly during training, but which takes on a whole different meaning when lives are actually on the line. David was nervous but competent, and I found myself slipping naturally into the role I'd been denied for so long. Mentor, teacher, the experienced pilot passing knowledge to the next generation. We worked through contingency plans, reviewed approach procedures, coordinated with air traffic control, and slowly, I watched David's confidence grow. "You know," he said during a brief lull, "I heard about what happened to you at Continental. It was complete garbage." I glanced at him sharply. "You heard about that?" "Everyone heard about it," he replied. "At least, everyone who was paying attention. Williams was a disaster waiting to happen, and you were the only one with the guts to report it." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I'd been carrying for 2 years. "Thank you for saying that." "It needed to be said," David replied simply. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. I don't think I could handle this alone." Neither of us mentioned the obvious irony, that I was here as a passenger because I'd been forced out of the industry, and now that same industry desperately needed my skills. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor. 2 hours out from London, the weather reports were getting worse. Fog was thickening, winds were gusting, and several flights had already diverted to alternate airports. But we had enough fuel to hold, and I had an idea. "David," I said, "I want you to hand fly this approach. Not the autopilot, not the flight director. Just you, me, and your training." He looked at me like I'd suggested we land the plane blindfolded. "Are you serious in these conditions?" "Dead serious," I replied. "The autopilot will get you down, but it won't make you a better pilot. This will. Trust me." And there it was, the moment that defined everything. Trust. The thing that had been systematically eroded during my final months at Continental. The thing I'd been told I didn't deserve. Now I was asking for it, and giving it, at 37,000 feet over the Irish Sea. David took a deep breath and switched off the autopilot. "Your aircraft," he said. the traditional phrase pilots use to transfer control. "My aircraft," I confirmed, then immediately handed it back. "Actually, your aircraft, David. I'm just here to back you up." What followed was 45 minutes of the most intense flying either of us had ever experienced. The approach to Heathrow was a maze of other aircraft holding in the fog, controllers routing us through complex patterns, constant updates on rapidly changing wind conditions. But David handled it beautifully, and I found myself remembering why I'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. Not for the glamour or the prestige, but for moments like these, when skill and training and pure human determination combine to accomplish something remarkable. "Minimums," I called out as we descended through the fog. David's hands were steady on the controls, his eyes locked on the instruments. This was it, the moment of truth. Either we would see the runway, or we would have to execute a missed approach and try again, burning precious fuel with each attempt. "Runway in sight," David called out, and I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with my own accomplishments and everything to do with watching a young pilot rise to meet an impossible challenge. "Looking good," I confirmed. "Stay with it." The landing was textbook perfect, smooth, and centered. The kind of landing that makes passengers applaud without really understanding why. As we taxied to the gate, emergency vehicles flanking us to attend to the captain, I looked around the cockpit one last time. This had been my world, my calling, my identity. And for 2.5 hours over the Atlantic, it had been mine again. "Sarah," David said as we shut down the engines, "I can't thank you enough. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been on board." I smiled at him, this earnest young pilot, who'd reminded me that not everyone in the industry was like the men who'd driven me out. "You would have figured it out," I told him. "That's what we do. We figure it out." But as I prepared to leave the cockpit and return to being just another passenger, David said something that stopped me cold. "There's going to be an investigation, into this incident. And I'm going to make sure they know exactly what happened here today, exactly who saved this flight." I looked at him, this kid who barely knew me, who was willing to put his own career on the line to tell the truth. "David, you don't have to do that." "Yes, I do," he replied firmly. "Because what they did to you was wrong, and because the industry needs pilots like you. Real pilots." As I walked back through the cabin, passengers were gathering their belongings, chatting about their close call, probably already turning the experience into stories they'd tell at dinner parties. Most of them would never know that their lives had been in the hands of a woman who'd been told she wasn't good enough to fly, who'd been systematically pushed out of the career she'd devoted her life to. They'd never know that their safe landing was, in many ways, an act of redemption. But I knew, and David knew, and sometimes that's enough. 3 weeks later, I was back in London, but this time I wasn't looking for work. Work had found me. The story had gotten out, despite efforts by certain parties to keep it quiet. Former female pilot saves transatlantic flight had made headlines around the world, and suddenly my phone was ringing with job offers from airlines who'd previously shown no interest in my qualifications. The irony was almost too perfect. I'd been unemployable as a pilot right up until the moment I'd proven, once again, that I was exactly what the industry needed. British Airways offered me a position as a senior captain, with a signing bonus that was frankly insulting in its generosity. They wanted to make me the face of their new diversity initiative, proof that they valued female pilots. I turned them down, not because I didn't want to fly again, but because I wanted to fly for the right reasons, with the right people. I wanted to work somewhere that would have hired me before I became a symbol, somewhere that valued my skills over my story. That place turned out to be a smaller carrier, Phoenix Air, that specialized in challenging routes and emergency medical flights. The CEO was a former military pilot named Margaret Santos, who'd been fighting the same battles I had for twice as long. "We don't need you for publicity," she told me during our interview. "We need you because you're a damn good pilot who knows how to handle herself in a crisis. The rest of it is just noise." I accepted her offer on the spot. My first flight with Phoenix was a medical evacuation from a remote airstrip in Scotland, challenging weather, minimal runway, critical patient. As I performed the pre-flight inspection, I caught my reflection in the cockpit window and barely recognized myself. Gone was the defeated woman who'd boarded that flight to London 3 months ago. In her place was someone I'd almost forgotten existed. Captain Sarah Mitchell, commercial airline pilot, exactly where she was supposed to be. The investigation into the Continental Airways incident had concluded while I was starting my new job. Williams had been terminated and lost his license permanently. 3 other executives had been demoted or transferred. And buried in the final report was a recommendation that the airline review its policies regarding whistleblower protection and discrimination complaints. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for in a system that's designed to protect its own. David had been promoted to captain ahead of schedule, a recognition of his performance during our emergency flight. He'd called to tell me the news and to let me know that he'd been assigned to the new pilot training program, where he planned to make sure that future aviators understood that flying wasn't about politics or prejudice or protecting the old boys network. It was about skill, professionalism, and the sacred responsibility of keeping people safe. "You taught me that," he said. "In 2.5 hours, you taught me what some pilots never learn in their entire careers." I'm writing this from 38,000 feet, somewhere over the North Sea, in command of Phoenix Air Flight 247 en route to Bergen, with a transplant organ that will save someone's life when we land. My co-pilot today is Lisa Park, a 26-year-old Korean-American woman who reminds me of myself 15 years ago. Brilliant, determined, and still naive enough to believe that competence is all that matters in aviation. I haven't told her otherwise. She'll figure out the rest on her own, and when she does, I'll be there to remind her that the bastards only win if you let them. The passenger in seat 12A today is a middle-aged businessman who spent the first hour of our flight complaining loudly about having some woman as his captain. He's been quiet since we hit turbulence over the channel, and I handled it with the kind of smooth professionalism that comes from 15 years of experience and the confidence that only emerges when you stop trying to prove yourself to people who were never going to believe in you anyway. Funny how competence has a way of shutting up the critics. Sometimes I think about that night over the Atlantic, about the chain of events that had to align perfectly for me to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. If I hadn't been blacklisted, I wouldn't have been on that flight. If the captain hadn't collapsed, I would have landed at Heathrow and spent 2 weeks interviewing for jobs that would never materialize. If David hadn't been willing to accept help from a disgraced female pilot, if Dr. Rodriguez hadn't been able to stabilize the captain, if the weather had been just a little bit worse, if any of a dozen variables had been different, this story would have ended very differently. But they weren't different, and this story ends exactly where it should, with me back in the cockpit, where I've always belonged, doing the work I was born to do. The executives who tried to destroy my career are probably still out there, still making the same decisions, still protecting the same systems. But they lost. Not because some cosmic justice intervened on my behalf, but because they forgot something fundamental about pilots. We don't give up. We adapt. We improvise. We overcome. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to prove that we were right all along. The kid next to me just asked if she can have a look at the controls during our approach to Bergen. I'm going to let her handle the radio work, let her feel what it's like to be the voice that guides us safely home. Because that's how this business really works. Not through corporate policies or diversity initiatives or public relations campaigns, but one pilot teaching another. One flight at a time, one safe landing after another. That's how we build the future we want to see. And if somewhere out there, there's another woman sitting in row 12 of some other flight, listening to a captain ask if there's a pilot on board, I hope she has the courage to stand up and answer the call. Because the sky belongs to all of us, and it's time everyone else figured that out.